In the autumn of 1700, inside the royal palace of Madrid, a horror unfolded that defied nature itself. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburgs, lay in his bed, not dying, but already rotting. His body, the product of 2 centuries of relentless inbreeding, was decomposing while his heart still beat. His jaw hung uselessly, saliva pooling on his chest. His eyes, sunken and vacant, stared at a ceiling he could no longer recognize. His organs were failing one by one, a heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs corroded by infection, intestines riddled with cancer. But the true tragedy wasn't just his body, it was his mind. Trapped in this decaying shell, Charles II could only grasp fragments of his own suffering. He knew people recoiled from him, he sensed their pity, their disgust, but he could never understand why. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, as if sorcery, not science, had cursed him. But the real curse was human, a dynasty that chose blood purity over humanity, incest over survival. This is the story of the king who ruled an empire while his own flesh betrayed him, of a man who was never truly alive and never truly aware. The final grotesque product of Europe's most catastrophic genetic experiment. This is the truth about Charles II of Spain. The tragedy of Charles II did not begin with his birth. It began centuries earlier, in the cold, calculating chambers of Habsburg diplomats who decided that power was too precious to share with outsiders. What started as a clever strategy, marrying within the family to keep crowns united, slowly mutated into a biological suicide pact. By the 15th century, the House of Habsburg had turned incest into state policy. Their motto, Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, was not just poetic. It was a death sentence for their own bloodline. The rot began in earnest with Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile. Joanna, already burdened by generations of Trastamara inbreeding, married her Habsburg cousin, binding 2 genetically compromised lines into one. Their son, Charles V, the emperor who ruled half the world, then married his own cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their children inherited not just empires, but a narrowing genetic corridor where defects multiplied with every generation. Philip II, his son, doubled down. He married 3 times, and 2 of his wives were his nieces. His son Philip III married his own cousin, and Philip IV, father of Charles II, took it further still. When Philip IV's first wife died, he didn't look beyond the family for a new bride. He turned to his own blood, his niece, Mariana of Austria, the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna of Spain. This union was a genetic catastrophe. Their child would carry the same man as both grandfather and great-grandfather, collapsing 4 generations into 2. Charles II wasn't just inbred. He was the product of a family tree that had folded in on itself until it resembled a knot, not a lineage. Historians have calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than the 0.25 of a child born from direct father-daughter incest. He had only 4 great-grandparents instead of 8. In his ancestry, the name Joanna of Castile appears no fewer than 12 times. The Habsburgs didn't just marry cousins, they married uncles to nieces, first cousins to first cousins, and granddaughters to grandfather's brothers. Each wedding was celebrated as a triumph of unity. In truth, it was a funeral for genetic diversity, and with every generation, the price grew steeper. The famous Habsburg jaw, once a subtle mark of imperial dignity, swelled into a grotesque deformity. Stillbirths became common, infant mortality soared. By the time Charles II was conceived, the dynasty wasn't producing heirs, it was producing warnings, but no one listened. Power, they believed, demanded purity. And purity, they were about to learn, demanded a king who could barely chew, speak, or think, a living monument to the arrogance of blood. When Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, in the royal Alcazar of Madrid, the midwives did not rejoice. They recoiled. The infant in their arms was not the robust heir the Spanish court had prayed for. His head was unnaturally large, his limbs frail as twigs, and his jaw already jutted forward in a way that made his mouth hang open like a broken hinge. He let out no healthy cry, only a weak, gurgling whimper that sent a chill through the birthing chamber. Court physicians exchanged silent glances. They had seen sickly princes before, but this was different. This child looked less like a future king and more like a warning from nature itself. From the very beginning, Charles defied normal development. He could not hold up his own head until he was 2 years old. He didn't sit unassisted until age 3. His first word, if it could even be called that, didn't come until he was 4, and it was so distorted by his malformed tongue and palate that no one could understand it. By age 8, he finally took his first steps, but only with constant support, his legs twisted and weak from muscular atrophy. His body seemed to reject the basic functions of life, as if his cells themselves were confused by the genetic chaos within. But it wasn't just his body that failed him. His mind struggled to grasp the world around him. He couldn't recognize faces consistently. He got lost in familiar corridors. Simple instructions, like drink your milk or kneel for prayer, had to be repeated endlessly. Yet, in fleeting moments, a spark of awareness flickered. He would stare at his reflection in a polished mirror, touch his swollen jaw with trembling fingers, and let out a low, mournful sound that his nurses interpreted as sorrow. It was as if he sensed he was broken, but could never understand why. The court, desperate to maintain the illusion of royal strength, concealed the worst of his condition. Official portraits painted him with dignity, strong jawline, clear eyes, regal posture, but those who saw him in person were horrified. The papal nuncio, after a private audience when Charles was just 20, wrote to Rome describing a prince so deformed that he inspires not reverence but revulsion. Foreign diplomats whispered in coded letters that the Spanish king resembled a carnival grotesque more than a monarch. Yet no one dared speak openly. To question the king's fitness was to question God's will, and in 17th century Spain, that was treason. Behind closed doors, doctors debated the cause. Some blamed witchcraft, hence the nickname El Hechizado. Others suspected divine punishment for Spain's sins. But the truth was far more mundane and far more damning. Charles II was the inevitable outcome of a family that had spent 200 years breeding itself into a biological dead end. His birth wasn't a miracle. It was the final, trembling note in a symphony of self-destruction. And as he grew, the world would watch, first in pity, then in horror, as the last Habsburgs slowly unraveled, piece by rotting piece. By his teenage years, Charles II was no longer merely sickly, he was a medical anomaly. His most infamous feature, the Habsburg jaw, had swollen into a grotesque deformity that defined his existence. His lower mandible protruded so far forward that his upper and lower teeth never met. He couldn't chew. He couldn't close his mouth. Saliva dripped constantly from his lips, soaking his collars and pooling on his chest. To eat, he had to swallow food in large, unchewed lumps, which his damaged digestive system could barely process. Chronic vomiting and diarrhea became routine. His body, starved of proper nutrition, grew frail and pale, while his head continued to swell with fluid, a condition that gave him a permanently distorted, almost alien appearance. His tongue, thick and swollen, protruded from his mouth like a raw wound. When he tried to speak, only guttural, slurred sounds emerged. unintelligible even to those who spent years at his side. Communication became a guessing game. Courtiers learned to interpret his gestures, his sighs, the direction of his vacant stare. Yet, in rare moments of clarity, Charles would fix his eyes on someone with sudden intensity, as if trying to say something urgent, something human. Those moments were the cruelest of all, fleeting glimpses of a mind trapped behind a failing body, aware enough to suffer, but not enough to escape. His neurological condition was equally devastating. Epileptic seizures struck without warning, sending his body into violent convulsions. During these episodes, his jaw would dislocate entirely, his eyes roll back, and fluids, saliva, urine, sometimes blood, would leak from every orifice. He would remain unconscious for hours, sometimes days, lying in his own filth until servants dared approach. Between seizures, his cognition remained fractured. He couldn't manage state affairs, couldn't remember names, couldn't even recognize his own ministers after a few weeks. Yet he understood enough to know he was different. He saw the way courtiers averted their eyes. He heard the hushed whispers when he entered a room. He felt the weight of their pity and their disgust. The psychological toll was immense. Though never formally diagnosed with depression, such concepts didn't exist then. His behavior spoke volumes. He withdrew into silence for days. He refused to attend public ceremonies. On rare occasions, he wept uncontrollably, clutching religious icons as if they could shield him from his own reflection. His confessor once wrote that the king suffers more in his soul than in his flesh, haunted by a fragmented awareness of his own monstrosity. Foreign dignitaries who met him were left traumatized. The French ambassador described him as a spectre wearing a crown. An English traveler claimed Charles looked less like a man and more like a wax figure left too long in the sun. Even his own family struggled to bear his presence. His mother, Mariana of Austria, though fiercely protective, admitted in private letters that seeing her son caused her a sorrow that borders on despair. Charles II was not evil, he was not cruel, he was a victim, a living experiment in genetic collapse. And as his body continued to betray him, Spain's empire crumbled around him, ruled not by a king, but by a ghost who didn't even know he was already dead. For a king like Charles II, marriage was never about love. It was a desperate gamble for an heir. By the time he turned 18, Spain's future hung in the balance. Without a successor, the Habsburg line would end, and Europe's fragile peace would shatter. But who would marry a man whose very appearance inspired terror? The answer came from France. In 1679, Louis XIV offered his niece, Marie-Louise of Orléans, a radiant, cultured princess raised in the splendor of Versailles, as a bride for the Spanish king. She accepted, believing she was marrying a sovereign, not a spectre. Their first meeting shattered that illusion. When Marie-Louise laid eyes on Charles II in the Hall of Mirrors at the Alcazar, she froze. His drooling mouth, swollen tongue, and vacant stare were unlike anything she had ever seen. According to court chronicler Antonio de Solis, she turned pale, swayed on her feet, and collapsed in a dead faint. When she awoke, she wept uncontrollably and begged her uncle to release her from the pact. Only the threat of war and the weight of dynastic duty forced her to go through with the ceremony. The wedding night was a catastrophe. Charles, physically and psychologically unprepared, was unable to consummate the marriage. His impotence, a direct result of his genetic decay, left Marie-Louise humiliated and trapped. Worse still, she developed an intense physical aversion to him. His constant drooling, his putrid breath, the way his body trembled during seizures, it all filled her with revulsion. She began avoiding his chambers entirely, inventing illnesses, retreating to distant wings of the palace, and surrounding herself with French ladies who shared her horror. Over the next decade, her despair deepened. She wrote secret letters to her family in France, describing her life as a living hell and pleading for rescue. "I am married to a corpse that breathes," she wrote in 1685. "Every day I die a little more." When she died suddenly in 1689 at just 26, the official cause was intestinal inflammation. But her autopsy told another story: signs of extreme stress, possible poisoning, and a body worn down by psychological torment. Many at court believed she had taken her own life, or that someone had helped her escape the nightmare. Charles remarried in 1690, this time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for one reason. Her family was famously fertile. Her parents had produced 23 children. Surely they thought her robust blood could overcome Charles's decay, but biology was not so forgiving. From the start, Mariana recoiled. Unlike Marie-Louise, she didn't faint, but she refused to be alone with him. She wore thick perfumes and lace masks during public appearances to block his stench. She claimed chronic migraines to avoid the marriage bed. And when forced to stand beside him at ceremonies, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her body rigid with dread. She never conceived, not because she was barren, but because Charles was incapable. His reproductive system, like the rest of him, had failed. Mariana spent her queenship in exile within her own palace, writing bitter letters home. "I am queen in name only. In truth, I am a prisoner of a ghost." Both women were sacrificed on the altar of dynastic pride, brides not to a king, but to a curse. And as they withered in silence, Charles II remained oblivious, still hoping, still waiting for a child who would never come. By the 1690s, Charles II was no longer merely ill. He was decomposing while still alive. His body, ravaged by decades of genetic collapse, began to exhibit signs of putrefaction long before death claimed him. His skin turned a sickly grey, stretched thin over bones that seemed to protrude unnaturally. His hair fell out in clumps before he turned 35, leaving his scalp mottled and exposed. But the most unbearable symptom was the odor. A thick, sweet stench of decay clung to him, a smell so potent that courtiers burned barrels of incense and myrrh in his chambers just to make his presence tolerable. Servants assigned to bathe him often vomited afterward. Even his closest attendants could only endure short shifts before fleeing for fresh air. His physical decline accelerated with terrifying speed. Fluid began accumulating in his tissues, a condition known as dropsy, causing his abdomen to swell grotesquely, and his face to balloon until his eyes nearly disappeared beneath folds of swollen flesh. His breathing grew labored, a wet, rattling sound that echoed through the palace corridors like the death rattle of a dying animal. He could no longer walk. He could barely sit upright. Most days he lay propped on silk cushions, drifting in and out of consciousness, his mouth agape, his hands trembling with constant tremors. Yet the cruelest aspect of his condition was his flickering awareness. In rare moments of lucidity, Charles would look around his gilded prison with dawning horror. He would try to speak, his tongue too swollen to form words, his jaw too dislocated to close. He would reach for a crucifix, clutch it tightly, and weep, silent tears rolling down his bloated cheeks. His confessor, Father Froilan Diaz, recorded these episodes in his private journal. "The king knows he is dying, but not how. He sees the fear in our eyes. He feels the weight of his own rot. And in those moments he is more human than ever, because he suffers as only a conscious soul can suffer." Doctors, helpless and horrified, documented his decline as if studying a medical marvel. One wrote that Charles exists in a state between life and death, a vegetable with a crown. Another described him as a soul imprisoned in a corpse that refuses to release it. They bled him, purged him, fed him elixirs of mercury and gold, but nothing slowed the inevitable. His body had begun shutting down years earlier. What remained was sheer biological inertia, sustained only by the desperate prayers of a court that refused to accept the end of an empire. Foreign powers watched with morbid fascination. Ambassadors sent coded dispatches describing the Spanish king who rots on his throne. Rumors spread that his flesh was peeling off in sheets, that his breath could kill birds, that his shadow carried disease. None of it was true, but all of it felt plausible. Because by 1699, Charles II was no longer a ruler, he was a warning, a walking testament to what happens when pride defies nature. And as he lay in his final year, drifting between pain and oblivion, Europe held its breath, not out of loyalty, but because everyone knew, when this broken man died, war would follow. His body was failing, but his death would ignite a continent. When Charles II drew his last breath on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38, the court did not mourn, they dissected. Within hours of his death, royal physicians performed a full autopsy, not out of curiosity, but to document the final proof of a dynasty's self-destruction. What they found inside the king's body was so horrifying that several surgeons reportedly wept. This was not the anatomy of a man. It was the wreckage of a genetic experiment gone catastrophically wrong. His heart, they recorded, was the size of a peppercorn, less than 1/3 the normal volume, so shrunken it could barely have sustained life. His lungs were blackened and scarred, riddled with chronic infections that had plagued him since childhood. His liver was hardened, his spleen enlarged, and his intestines were a mass of ulcerated tissue, riddled with tumors and signs of advanced cancer. But the most damning evidence lay in his reproductive system. One testicle was completely necrotic, black as coal and cold to the touch. The other had withered to almost nothing. No wonder he had produced no heir. His body had rendered him sterile long before he reached manhood. His urinary tract was equally devastated. 3 large kidney stones, each the size of a grape, had blocked his system for years. His bladder was filled not with urine, but with thick, pus-filled fluid, a sign of chronic, systemic infection that had poisoned his blood for decades. When they opened his skull, the horror deepened. Instead of healthy brain tissue, they found it flooded with clear fluid, hydrocephalus so severe it explained his seizures, his cognitive delays, his vacant stare. His brain had been drowning in its own fluid since infancy. Perhaps most chilling was the conclusion of the lead physician. Many of Charles' vital organs had stopped functioning properly years before his death. His body had been in a state of slow, irreversible decay since his 20s. He hadn't just been sick, he had been dying day by day for nearly 2 decades. His survival to 38 was not a miracle of medicine, but a testament to the sheer brutality of his suffering. He had been kept alive not by health, but by will, or perhaps by the desperate prayers of a court unwilling to face the end of Habsburg rule. The autopsy report was sealed, but rumors spread like wildfire. In Paris, London, and Vienna, diplomats whispered that the Spanish king's body had been more corpse than man. In Madrid, the people spoke of divine judgment. But the truth was simpler and far more damning. Charles II was not cursed by God or witchcraft. He was the inevitable product of a family that chose blood purity over human survival. For 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had treated marriage like a ledger, balancing territories, not genes. And in the end, nature collected its debt in full. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a 13-year conflict that killed millions and redrew the map of Europe. All because one dynasty refused to accept a basic truth, that diversity, not purity, is the engine of life. Charles II's body was the final exhibit in that lesson. And as his organs were catalogued, buried, and forgotten, They left behind a warning etched not in stone, but in flesh. Defy nature, and nature will rot you from the inside out. Charles II of Spain did not die a king. He died a cautionary tale. The last Habsburg was not felled by war, betrayal, or rebellion, but by the very blood that was supposed to make him divine. For 200 years his ancestors believed that purity of lineage equaled strength. Instead, it bred weakness, deformity, and extinction. Charles was never truly alive, not in the way that matters. He was a vessel of accumulated sins, a living autopsy of dynastic arrogance. His reign left no legacy of laws, no monuments, no victories, only silence, and a throne so tainted that Europe tore itself apart just to decide who would inherit the rot. Today, his portraits hang in museums, not as tributes, but as evidence. Evidence of what happens when power blinds humanity to its own fragility. Charles II was not bewitched. He was engineered. And in his hollow eyes, swollen jaw, and broken body, we see the ultimate price of believing that blood alone makes a king. He ruled an empire while his own flesh betrayed him. And in the end, nature won.